Hello. Here we are. March 6, 2010. We're taking a look at the state of the compost. This is where it all began, with a small and generous offering from the great everworm, a worm stock, a little red worm that comes from our esteemed friend who runs a worm composting business. And starting with the generous gift of no more than 3 to 4 inches of some rice and newspaper and a cup of worms. In this container you see, we were on our way towards first this compost, and then second, actually compost made in this pile, or this container, but eventually transferred here. It's about 3 months behind. That's the best part of living here in Eva Beach, is that we get to watch the quick fix to our economy. Tourists fly in. In fact, anytime you're interested in traveling out to Hawaii and learning a bit more about composting, let me know. I'll be happy to accommodate you. So here we have our first generation, starting with 3 to 4 inches of rice, newspaper, other discarded food waste from a recycling vent at Copley High School. Using ever red worms, we have generation 1. This is all bespent, as we'll see in a few seconds. From there, some worms are put into this pile, which has been over time lots and lots of composted newspaper and composted office waste and shredded office waste. For a little while we had a series of small worms, small types of larvae, I suppose, that the worms had to deal with. But over time we've had outstanding fair trade coffee beans and food product, and even coffee filters. This is a recent addition which soon will be gone, all which have been consumed by the worms and turned into vermicompost, or worm poop, and it's quite healthy. Now here was perhaps our most interesting experiment, because it was in this compost pile that I added lots of food product early on that had become spoiled by a moth that got into the kitchen and laid larvae and lots of my beans and food stock. So a fair amount of uncooked food came out here, and while you see just some recent additions on the top, what's happened is that over time this material here was quite challenging to work with, being a combination of yard waste, office waste, newspaper, and uncooked food. It was a battle for a while, but the worms succeeded. Let's take a closer look. So in here we can turn the material, and we're going to find very few worms and mostly thoroughly composted and degraded and worm-consumed food or soil. You know, packs like this that once were full of worms, and now it's just a very healthy, no smell, just a supremely fertile soil. This is about November, about 16 months. So throughout here you'll see very few worms, but this is completely finished material. What doesn't degrade? Pieces of shredded plastic, white plastic, some late edition of paper. Here, however, we simply peel back the first layer and we have active worms. And if we do a quick flip, you'll see several worms, some large and healthy, some smaller. But as there's an active food source in here, the material's a lot rougher. There's still eggshells and things to eat, and they're working on it. This is the newest collection of compost. And let's bring this camera in closer so you can see what we're looking at. So here we have material and soil that's just now beginning to go from compost to vermicast. It once was office paper, food material. So we see the worms, we see lots of sources of worms. Here's a big colony here. And in this case, you can take, staying focused, here you can take clumps and you're going to find large sections of worms still consuming. So this is still a work in process. To add to the quality of feed, we'll add a little top level cardboard shading. Now observe this, because within a few months, if not sooner, this will be dirt. In fact, before we go any further, let's take a still shot. So we've just turned this compost. It's the most recent, certainly the most challenging, in that it was the closest to garbage and the furthest from food waste. And in between, our first sample that's got nearly no worms and is ready to harvest, and the freshest sample with lots of worms that, while darker, it's still not ready to harvest. We have the, in between sample. And here we have healthy soil Slight scraping is going to reveal a decent concentration of worms. Examination of the soil is that it's somewhere in between being ready to use and plant in a garden and being a very fertile worm bank. These worms, should you order them from the same person that provided them to me, will undoubtedly provide you equal, if not better, performance. Because I'm a pretty thrifty eater. But this is a good example of what happens when you take coffee grinds and food waste, like eggs, and give it time. You find that you've fed your worms extremely well, and that consequently you feed your garden very well. Here we see in a clump different worms, maybe smaller, maybe the same concentration as a fresher compost pile. But here it's closer and nearly ready for harvest, and this is a good opportunity for these worms to be spread to a new pile, which I'll be starting shortly. Hello. And so here we have the emergence of what will end up being the same type of compost we've seen in the other piles. This is a collection of grass trimmings and leaf trimmings, or shrub trimmings, collections of leaves and branches, mostly green. You've got nuts from this tree above us. We've got lots of dried leaves, and over time we've added coffee grinds, and over time with heat most of the green waste has turned dark, and there's fewer worms because we haven't fed it yet, but we've got, in this case, mostly natural compost with some vermicompost, or worm poo-poo. Whereas the other piles of debris were marginally cool, this is still warm to the touch. Boy, and if you're a fisherman, how about that for a worm? So the worms that are in this pile have migrated naturally either from the ground or from one of my compost containers. So we'll take a few minutes to turn this. And here you'll find some rather large worms. So simple steps like this to turn some of the peripheral waste on the side. This is vacuum trimmings, collection of debris and everything from my vacuum bags, which is mostly dog hair. Turning these things into the pile. Spread it around a little. Reaching in and digging our hands in the goodness. We start to have a reasonably healthy pile that will help to feed by covering with some old clothes. And we'll see where this goes over time. So here we have the freshest but emerging compost. It's somewhere further along than these leaves and grass trimmings, but these will eventually take on a state that's a bit more like this. And then from there, we'll see it look a bit more like what we saw in here. And then of course from there, we'll have something similar to like this. Finally leaving us with compost and debris and dirt that's ready to harvest, that's nearly devoid of worms, that is about as healthy and as natural as you can get. I'm not eating it. Boy, does this smell good. So I'm Scott Belford, here in Ewa Beach, Hawaii, sharing with you how simple it is to compost. And if I could do this, you can do it. And coffee grinds, my friends. Coffee grinds make for very happy worms. Aloha.